Thank you very much for that last session. I think there were some valuable insights into the role of people and citizens inside government and citizens outside government, what they can each do, how they each play their roles, and so on. Very much appreciate those thoughts. Now we come to the point, first session we talked about how citizens see the relationship, and then we talked about if that's the kind of relationship that exists in fact, what are the implications of that for the policymakers? And then at lunchtime we heard very interesting thoughts about the relationship between citizens outside government and citizens inside government in shaping the environment within which policy is made. And then in the last session, we talked about how governments might conduct the relationship in such a way as to strengthen public constituencies for the relationship. And now, of course, we come to the ultimate question: what is the potential of this relationship? Where might it go, and how might it usefully go there? So I've asked each of the panelists to take about 5 minutes to respond to that question, and then we will do, as we did before, open the floor here to exchanges, and then to open the floor there to thoughts and comments, questions. So I'm just going to work my way across the panel here from my right to my left. And Jack? Again, you have biographies of everybody, and everybody knows who Spig Brzezinski is, so he's happily joined us at this point. I'm not going to spend time introducing. Go ahead.
Well, I take it that our task in this panel is to look at the future of the Russia-U.S. relationship in a new Euro-Atlantic security system. Now, I start from the proposition that there is not a single major problem facing the United States and Russia in the 21st century that can be solved without the cooperation of those two countries. Now, this is true whether it's the nuclear issues, proliferation, threat of terrorism, drug trafficking, international organized crime, disease spread, environmental degradation. These very large problems, of course, are international and are going to require international cooperation. And therefore, for America, I think Russia is going to be either part of the solution or part of the problem, to use the old cliche. For Russia, the United States is either going to be part of the solution or part of the problem. And it should be a no-brainer which one we choose. Now, it seems to me that one of the major things that has gotten in the way of both sides concentrating on what is most important has been a number of misunderstandings. I spoke about them in general on the previous panel, particularly misunderstandings about how the Cold War ended, and also misunderstandings about the nature of the current globalizing world. We still, on both sides, in both countries, and for that matter elsewhere in the world, have a distorted idea, in many cases, of what happened in the Cold War, of what caused the breakup of the Soviet Union. And there is an indication on both sides to continue to put things in the sort of zero-sum competitive approach that applied during the Cold War, when you had two different systems of government with totally different philosophies competing for influence in the world. Now we don't have that. And so the idea that the tensions that have developed between the United States and Russia are in some way beginning to renew the Cold War, and we all know that these views have been expressed, and particularly just a few years ago. I think that's absurd. That's a misunderstanding of what the Cold War was all about. What we are seeing is, in my opinion, a recurrence of confrontations, misunderstandings, growing out of issues that in many cases have been seriously misread by the other side. I do think that in the globalizing world, the sort of competition between empire builders that marked the 19th century and seriously marred the 20th century is something of the past. The day of empires has passed because in today's world, attempts to rule people who don't want you to rule them is more a source of weakness rather than a source of strength. And yet, so much of our political dialogue in foreign policy has to do with which country is getting more influence here, which country there. Is there a great game going on in the Caucasus or in Central Asia between the United States and Russia, the West and Russia? These concepts, it seems to me, though they may at times have had a certain partial validity in certain contexts, are totally out of place in the 21st century. And to the degree we let them guide our behavior, we tend to ignore where the real problems are and what we need to do in order to cooperate to deal with them. So first of all, we do need a change in attitudes on part of significant portions of our policy-making community. I'll put it that way. And particularly, I think, in the United States and the West, this idea that somehow the Cold War ended in a quasi-victory by Western countries and that Russia was a defeated country, that the Cold War ended with the world having just one superpower, which had the power, if it used that, to transform other countries. These, I think, were distinctly mistaken notions. The idea of superpower, what do we mean by that? Well, during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world. Yeah, I guess that's superpower. Did they have the power?
We still have.
Yeah, I'm sorry?
We still have.
Yes, more than once. Yeah, I guess that's power. Power to destroy. Is it power to build? Is it power to create? And I'll tell you a little non-secret. U.S. and Russia still have that power. Why? Because neither of us are going to use them. Because there's no rational use. And this is one of the questions we need to face. Were either of us superpowers in terms of being able to solve other people's problems? Look at the problems in the Middle East. Are they better or worse than they were during the Cold War? Some people would say then, well, you know, if the Soviet Union wasn't supporting one side and the United States the other, you wouldn't have the problem. Nonsense. Those problems are local. And they can be exacerbated by policies of others, but not created and not solved. So the whole idea that there was a unipolar world or even a unipolar moment, I think, was simply a mistaken idea. And this is one which I think led us astray in our assessment of many things that happened. Now, I believe we, in both countries, are beginning to get away from those stereotypes that I think were particularly common in the United States in the Bush-Cheney administration. And they also have been, as you know, very widespread in Russia itself in its talk about the unipolar world and how you want multipolarity. I'll tell you, I think the world has always been multipolar in terms of really solving the real problems. And it was an illusion on the part of Americans to think that military force alone could change some of this. And it was also an illusion of others that the United States could somehow create a new empire by using that force. But I think we're all are beginning to learn. How should we go about developing a Euro-Atlantic relationship? I think, as several of our participants said in our working group over the weekend, the reason this is important is that if you look at all the world's problems, the most serious ones, the only group of countries that has the potential to either solve them or see that they're not solved is that Euro-Atlantic community. Vancouver to Vladivostok is one way to put it. The long way around, of course. And therefore, it is important in many things that somehow we find a way to have a security system there. It seems to me the requirement there is to find a mechanism by which Russia is a full member of that European security community, with the same guarantees that others have and with the same obligations. Now, it is the obligations, perhaps, that run into potential difficulties. But it does seem to me that we need to take President Medvedev's proposal seriously. It was a general one, and one that should be the initiation of discussions, and with both sides coming out with further ideas. I think to be a real security community, it has to deal with more than the military aspect, and must get into other things, some of which may not be palatable to the Russian government at the moment. But this is an area, I think, for fruitful discussion. It's very hard, as we have already said, in other contexts, to get that sort of fruitful discussion among government officials who have responsibility to current policies. So I think a mechanism such as the Dartmouth Conference is ideally suited to begin to think through the steps that might be taken. I would say that willy-nilly we are going to find that the security architecture is changing. The United States is going to be forced to play a less prominent military role in the world simply because we can't afford it anymore. And the rest of the world, I think, is going to have to learn to take a greater role in taking care of its own security interests. And we need to find a balance to shift to that in a smoother way than has happened in the past. But it seems to me objective reality forces us to address that. And I think we at least can see with the current American administration and with recent moves by the Russian government that our countries are fortunately moving in that direction now. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Belikov?
Спасибо. Ну, я очень благодарен руководству Дартмутского движения, что меня пригласили на эту замечательную встречу 50 лет. Это, конечно, исторический факт такой. 50 лет постоянной работы, упорной работы. Самые трудные времена, когда наши политические отношения поднимались вверх и вниз. Но я на самом-то деле первый раз по-настоящему на Дартмундской встрече. Поэтому я в какой-то степени смотрю на все со стороны, ну и мне легче, может быть, сделать некоторые замечания, соображения. Ну, прежде всего, я бы хотел сказать, что до каких, может ли вообще быть ситуация, в которой Россия и Соединенные Штаты являются настоящими партнерами, стопроцентными партнерами. Это вот тот вопрос, который, я понимаю, ключевой и который здесь обсуждался. Вы знаете, вот в моей жизни я прошел такой этап, и он продолжается, в котором мы с Соединенными Штатами, вот Россия, российская часть и Соединенные Штаты стопроцентные партнеры. Этот этап связан с с самым крупным сегодня научно-техническим проектом, с проектированием, а теперь сооружением экспериментального термоядерного реактора ИТЕР. Это проект, в который участвуют Соединенные Штаты, участвует Россия, участвует Европейский Союз, все 27 стран, участвует Китай, участвует Корея, Япония, Индия. В общем, больше половины человечества. Надо сказать, конечно, сложный проект, потому что у всех разная культура. Но что я должен вам сказать, что за это время, и начиная, в общем-то, где-то с 70-х годов, середины 70-х годов, мы, вот те, кто участвует в этом проекте, превратились в единую команду, в единое, так сказать, сообщество, которое в самые трудные времена 100% доверяло друг другу. У нас не было никаких секретов, мы обсуждали все вопросы, политические, неполитические, во все самые трудные вопросы. Ну, политически нас не очень занимали, но тоже приходилось. И 100% доверяли и доверяем друг другу. Иногда у нас бывают, конечно, сложные ситуации. Была сложная ситуация, когда Соединенные Штаты вышли из проекта, вернулись обратно. Это отдельная история. Но, например, только что мы закончили другую сложную ситуацию, в которой у нас были большие трения с Брюсселем, с Европейским Союзом. Я не скажу, что с Европейским сообществом научным, но вот именно с руководством. И в этой ситуации мы выступали абсолютно единым фронтом с Соединенными Штатами и с их союзниками Японией и другими. У нас не было никаких политических, так сказать, влияний или преференций. У нас была одна цель – добиться осуществления этого проекта, который действительно важен для всех стран. Мы преодолевали разные сложные моменты. Я помню, был момент в самом начале, когда стал вопрос о том, кто будет участвовать от Европы в этом проекте. В этот момент мне мои коллеги сказали, что единственный вариант – это Евроатом. Но Советский Союз не признавал Евроатом. Ну, я так подумал, что делать. Подписал я эту бумагу, что Евроатом будет участником со стороны Европы. Дома я уже в Центральном комитете, в министерстве, которое отвечало за это, оправдывался тем, что у меня плохое знание английского языка. Ну и как-то обошлось. Были и другие, конечно, моменты. Один из самых важных моментов был момент в 1985 году, когда на встрече в Женеве президент Рейган и генеральный секретарь Горбачев подписали вот этот проект. Сопротивление со стороны, как вы помните, Пентагона было очень большое. Больше всего мне помог вот Джек. Он был тогда в Совете Безопасности. И надо сказать, что его такое вот спокойное, настойчивое руководство привело к тому, что этот проект пошел. Этот проект серьезный. Я не буду здесь дальше рассказывать, но он дал мне, конечно, понимание того, что фактически у нас нет пределов для доверия и партнерства. Вопрос только заключается в том, какие цели мы преследуем. Вот где-то в 1986 году моя жена меня вовлекла в проект, связанный с детскими обменами. И я пошел туда именно потому, что мне хотелось, чтобы российское поколение новое, дети, они пережили бы вот именно такое же чувство братства, чувство товарищества, партнерства, которое есть между учеными. Мы там поставили цель, что к 2000 году в этом проекте должно пройти примерно 100 тысяч школьников, детей, российских и американских. Вот сегодня у нас через этот проект прошло 9 миллионов. Я должен сказать, что это один из самых удачных проектов. Смысл его заключается в том, что школьники получают тот навык, который, конечно, в Советском Союзе и в России сейчас очень как раз является наибольшим дефицитом. Навык, так сказать, свободного предпринимательства. И это есть в значительной степени тоже плод нашего сотрудничества, потому что по-настоящему нас поддерживали только американцы. Но зато все, и все послы, и все президенты, каждый из них персонально поддерживал. Вот сейчас, только что вчера, мы имели встречу, на которой тоже получим. Я должен сказать, что вообще этот вопрос очень серьезный, потому что я сейчас думаю, что когда мы говорим о будущем нашего сотрудничества, то сейчас мы должны понимать, что сегодня 3 поколения активны. Ну вот мое поколение, которое уже уходит, поколение детей, его иногда называют гламурным, и поколение внуков. И поколение внуков от 0 до 20 лет. Через 10 лет они будут решающими. И поэтому, как это поколение, с одной стороны, может смыть все наши грехи, а с другой стороны, если мы не поможем им выбрать правильный путь, понимаете? 20 лет – это момент, когда в нашем подсознании складывается полное восприятие модели мира. И вот какое это восприятие? Надо сказать, что сегодня никто не умеет по-настоящему управлять и понимать, что это за восприятие. Здесь играет роль и культурные факторы, и образовательные, и политические, и просто реальная жизненная обстановка вокруг. Поэтому мне кажется, что если говорить о том, где будут наиболее, так сказать, эффективные инвестиции в будущее, то именно здесь. Вот именно в работе с этим поколением. И здесь нам предстоит очень много чего сделать. В том числе здесь есть такие вопросы, которые нас часто разделяют. Например, который принципиальный вопрос – права человека. Вот у нас есть очень серьезный вопрос, который, я думаю, и у вас есть, и в Америке. Спрашивается, имеет ли семья, каково соотношение прав семьи и прав ребенка? В России это, к сожалению, сегодня очень острый вопрос. Те, кто борется за крепкую семью, они в то же время рассматривают ребенка как собственность этой семьи. Есть такая проблема. Вторая проблема может быть еще более сложной, потому что на самом деле личность появляется через неделю, 2 недели после зачатия. И спрашивается, а вот эта личность, которая рождается уже еще пока внутри, в утробе матери, она имеет права? Какие права имеет эта личность? Это тоже, как вы знаете, очень сильно разделяет людей. Права матери на себя, на свое здоровье, ну, то есть связано с абортами и прочим. Здесь не только религиозный, не столько религиозный вопрос, сколько действительно принципиальный вопрос. Его надо решать. И я думаю, что это тоже одна из вот тех частей, которые касаются детства. Теперь я хотел бы сказать, что вот среди тех проблем, которые перечислил Джек, я как-то не услышал энергии. Ну, я всю жизнь занимаюсь именно вопросами энергетики, но просто я хочу сказать, что, понимаете, мое впечатление, вот наши расчеты показывают такую вещь. Вот 2 раза затраты на энергетику превысили 10% от глобального GNP, глобального валового продукта. И когда они подошли, то первый кризис был в 1983 году, а второй кризис был совсем недавно. Это, в общем-то, процесс, который мы вообще на самом деле очень плохо знаем, как им управлять. Если посмотреть более внимательно, то особых идей у нас нету, потому что это не просто вопрос того, что не хватает ресурсов, это значительно более сложный вопрос. И, конечно, решить этот вопрос мы можем только вместе. И мы должны преодолеть здесь целый ряд национальных, так сказать, предрассудков и больших проблем. Это вот то, что касается энергетики. Конечно, очень серьезный вопрос сейчас, но это и возможность. Это вопрос о том, что Россия сейчас активно занимается действительно реальной реформой. Потому что Сколково это не есть просто некий такой вот проект, как иногда считают, создание острова благополучия посреди российского безобразия. Нет, это, конечно, значительно больше. Это попытка, так сказать, начав именно в этом месте, создать условия, реально нормальные условия, прежде всего, для бизнеса. Вы понимаете, что сегодня у нас в России сегодня эти условия не только трудные для большого бизнеса, когда бывают проблемы, но прежде всего они трудны для малого бизнеса. Чтобы открыть новую компанию, молодому человеку приходится в 10 раз больше тратить денег и в 10 раз больше тратить времени. Тут сюда входит и все, и коррупция, и все прочее. Но самое главное, что и законодательство, и вся социальная структура, все категорически против развития бизнеса. И Сколково – это попытка. Но надо сказать, что это намного больше, потому что президент Медведев твердо, так сказать, заявил совсем недавно, вы знаете это, что его идея заключается в том, что модернизация России будет возможна только при самом глубокой кооперации с Западом. Ну и прежде всего и с Соединенными Штатами. Ну вот я сейчас тоже вовлечен, я вхожу в Совет Сколково, и мы сейчас вовсю ведем переговоры, договариваемся с моими старыми друзьями, скажем, в Массачусетском технологическом институте и так далее. Сегодня в Совете научном Сколково 2 сопредседателя. Один – это Нобелевский лауреат русский, а другой – Нобелевский лауреат американский. И половина членов научного совета – это иностранцы. Таким образом, понимаете, не только иностранный капитал, не столько, но и иностранное управление, и не только иностранные советники, но и реальное управление. На это мы настроены. Поэтому сейчас, конечно, есть определенное окошко, как говорится, Windows Opportunity, да, в отношениях между Россией и Соединенными Штатами, потому что то, как пойдет модернизация, во многом повлияет на наши отношения. Конечно, у нас остается масса вопросов, и надо сказать, что как-то я вот сейчас еще послушал вопрос, связанный с противоракетной обороной, тактическим ядерным оружием. У меня какое-то впечатление, что мы вообще-то сделали большой шаг назад, лет на 20, в понимании этих вопросов. И с другой стороны, вот то, что эти вопросы как-то в общественном сознании сегодня почти отсутствуют, это, конечно, серьезное дело. Нам тут нужно быть осторожными, потому что мы можем попасть в сложную ситуацию и опять вернемся к старым проблемам. Но я все-таки сказал, что сегодня на первом этапе, слава Богу, находятся вопросы нашего партнерства, сотрудничества, развития нашего будущего. И здесь, по-моему, у нас очень хорошая дорога. И вот тут диалог политический. Я никогда не был политическим животным. Я был далек от политики, но я очень с большим почтением отношусь к Дартмутскому диалогу и считаю, что он является одним из ключевых, так сказать, инструментов построения нашего совместного будущего. Спасибо.
Thank you. Spig, do you want to go next?
All right.
You'll have time.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm sorry I couldn't participate in the other sessions, but in a sense, this meeting to me is an extension of a meeting that I participated in last week in Moscow, in which there was an opportunity to discuss some of the same issues. And I had the task of responding to a speech by Foreign Minister Lavrov, which in itself was an interesting experience and a constructive one, I hasten to add. And then later on, I participated in a meeting with President Medvedev for about an hour and a half, in which a number of the same subjects were discussed. And I was very impressed by his commitment to the idea of a closer relationship with the West as a whole, and to the idea of modernization of Russia, including in that context the notion that it is closely related to the democratization of Russia, a point of view which, of course, gives one great hope and is very encouraging in terms of the relationship between America and Russia. In my comments here today, I thought I would restrict myself to making 4 quick points, perhaps setting a precedent of living up to the 5-minute limit for individual presentations. And I would like to concentrate on points which, in my judgment, ought to be an integral part of the process of constructing, in fact, a qualitatively different and better relationship between the West and Russia. My first point is very simple, but it's important to reiterate it. Any security system, any revised security system, not necessarily a new system, because a new system would implicitly be replacing something else, and that cannot be done very easily, given the traditions, history, and commitments of both sides. Any revised system has to involve 3 parties: Europe, America, and Russia, Russia, Europe, and America, in whatever sequence. But that is a fundamental proposition, and therefore it cannot be constructed by individual states working separately, but it has to be those 3 parties viewed as the major principles. The second point I want to emphasize is that in creating a system of that sort, a step-by-step approach is preferable to some grand architectural design. Grand architectural designs are appealing intellectually, but in fact they can only be created in extraordinary circumstances when something else has dramatically collapsed or exploded. That is not the situation in the East-West relationship today. We therefore have to work at creating something better by moving step by step, achieving changes that over time change quantity into quality. And these changes, to some extent, have to involve also changes within societies, either in their outlook or in their institutional arrangements. My third point is that any significant change in the East-West security relationship, not only Russia, Europe, and America have to be involved, but also, for example, Ukraine and perhaps other states that used to be part of the Soviet Union. I mention Ukraine because it is an important state. It is right on the East-West, so to speak, dividing line, and therefore it is important that it be part of such an enterprise, obviously working closely with its immediate neighbors, in particular Russia. I have for years been saying that Ukraine's relationship with Russia ideally should be like between the United States and Canada, but it also means that there is opportunity for Ukraine to have its own defined relationship with its adjoining neighbors and the West in general. That would certainly create also greater stability and would reinforce mutual confidence of all the parties that the process is geopolitically far-reaching. And my fourth and last point is that the creation of a new system, which is genuinely based on confidence and increasingly not only on mutual trust, but mutually shared interests, has to go beyond government-to-government arrangements. One can have government-to-government arrangements which seemingly involve reconciliation, but they don't really last that long. I think the most dramatic, and I don't say this in a polemical fashion, but the most dramatic example of a government-to-government arrangement which was in effect a reconciliation occurred in August of 1939 and was dramatically terminated in June of 1941. And that was a government-to-government arrangement at very high levels indeed. I think we need an arrangement in which there is genuine reconciliation between the peoples of the countries or of the states involved. And that means reconciliation in depth and in scope. And good examples of that are, first of all, the Franco-German reconciliation, without which there wouldn't be today a unifying Europe that calls itself a union, but is essentially still largely a community. A good example of that is the much more difficult and much more painful reconciliation, nonetheless achieved, between Germany and Poland. And a hopeful example of a process underway is the ongoing effort by the Russians and the Poles to achieve a reconciliation that goes beyond the governments, but addresses also the shared, collective, and often painful memories of the peoples involved. And that means addressing even painful historical issues, addressing them in a fashion which gives one's confidence that those issues are only history today and only doesn't take into account the pain involved, but only in the sense they are no longer binding on the future, and that the future can be defined with a greater degree of confidence and mutual trust and mutual sympathy. I think if such a process goes on over 10 or so years, I think we can have a truly different relationship. I was struck, incidentally, that Medvedev, in one of his comments in response to what I had said, noted that his hope is that the relationship on the ground between the people of Russia and the people of Europe will be qualitatively, comprehensively different within a decade. I think that is a reasonable time frame, and it will work, especially if all three major parties engage seriously in this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Big. Vitaly?
Спасибо, Хелл. Я буду по-русски говорить. Я тоже несколько пунктов постараюсь сказать коротко. Во-первых, первый пункт – это то, что я подчеркиваю, что впервые произошел столь серьезный поворот в российской политической ориентации, когда наш президент прямо фактически сказал, что Запад сегодня является главным направлением российской внешней политики. Это серьезно. Это нравится вовсе не всем моим согражданам в нашей стране. И у нас есть определенные, так сказать, сегменты общественного мнения, которые выступают за евразийскую стратегию. И учитывая наше географическое положение, этот вопрос не столь очевиден, как кажется, но это выбор, который сегодня сделан, и мне кажется, его нужно нашим коллегам на Западе и в том числе в США поддержать. А второй пункт касается той системы евроатлантической безопасности, новой системы, новой архитектуры, о которой мы сегодня говорим, и которой касается предложения президента Медведева. Очень важно знать, против кого будет направлена эта система, от кого мы будем вместе защищаться. И здесь очень важно представлять себе ту особую все-таки ситуацию, в которой находится Россия, находящаяся на стыке действительно Европы и Азии, и имеющая соседство с исламским миром, с миром, который сегодня имеет сложные отношения с Западом, в том числе и с Соединенными Штатами, и где сегодня наша поддержка действий Альянса в Афганистане, опять же, нравится далеко не всем. И у нас также есть сегменты общественного мнения, которые считают, что этого делать было не нужно. И, наконец, у нас есть Китай. И я думаю, что выбор в пользу треугольника Россия, Европа или Европейский Союз и Америка, он сделан. Но не будем забывать, что у нас есть рядом Китай, и есть мощный треугольник Соединенные Штаты, Китай, Россия. И многие считают, и мне кажется, это в чем-то правильно, что значительная часть событий 21 века будет разворачиваться именно внутри этого треугольника. И как эти отношения будут развиваться, я думаю, от этого много будет зависеть в мировой политике. Так же, как и то, что сегодня экономически для России, которая крайне необходимо развивать Дальний Восток и Восточную Сибирь, очень активно и очень серьезно думает о своей роли в Азиатско-Тихоокеанском регионе. Не будем забывать, что в конечном счете от Ванкувера до Владивостока ближе идти через Тихий океан, чем через всю Европу и на запад, дальше от России. Наконец, следующий пункт, о котором я хотел бы сказать, это то, что здесь говорилось о вот пресловутом окне возможностей. Ну, наверное, сложно говорить об окнах, когда есть двери, причем они открыты. Но в эти открытые двери не всегда идет бизнес, не всегда идут наши западные друзья, я имею в виду экономическое сотрудничество, его явно сегодня не хватает. Я понимаю, что в этом отчасти повинна Россия, но поддержка тех шагов, которые сегодня делает наше руководство, я думаю, также необходима. Я абсолютно согласен, что вот беспрецедентный шанс примирения с Польшей – это очень важное для России дело. И то, что сегодня открываются новые документы по Катыни, я думаю, это очень важно. Конечно, можно спросить, кто мешал это сделать раньше. Но как бы то ни было, это делается. И тот трагический инцидент, который произошел, он действительно сегодня открывает совершенно новую возможность установления новых отношений России с Польшей. Россия с Европой – это вектор, на котором, возможно, будут развиваться наиболее драматические события, где идет, возвращаясь к вопросу об энергии, где также устанавливаются беспрецедентно тесные отношения взаимозависимости. И, как я уже говорил вот на нашей Task Force Дартмутской, необходимо, конечно, учитывать, что Россия вышла и выходит сегодня из тяжелейшего кризиса, который был связан с распадом мощного государства, и который произошел со сменой и режима, и политической ориентации, и с преодолением инерции распада. И как раз Сбиг очень хорошо эту тенденцию распада уловил и показал в своих работах, которые, по-моему, все читают в России, абсолютно все. Во всяком случае, все мои студенты всегда возвращаются к работам Бжезинского. И идут дискуссии серьезные. Но так вот, преодолели мы эту тенденцию распада или не преодолели? У России есть определенный синдром, есть определенная боязнь, связанная с, как я уже говорил в предыдущем выступлении, коротко только скажу, с тем, что нас часто завоевывали, у нас и были в нашей истории, как вы знаете, когда войска входили в Москву, у нас были беспрецедентные жертвы, и оценивать нашу острую потребность повышения уровня безопасности для наших граждан крайне необходимо для того, чтобы понять, что у нас сегодня наш бросок на Запад, это марш-бросок, который делает Россия, я думаю, он должен быть поддержан. Без этой поддержки он просто может захлебнуться. И в заключение я хотел бы сказать, что поскольку здесь поставлена тема о будущем российско-американских отношений в новом евроатлантической системе безопасности, я хотел бы вернуться к предложениям, которые были сделаны некоторыми нашими коллегами по Дартмуту, особенно Томом Грэмом, я помню, он об этом говорил, о том, что американский капитал, американские предприниматели могут сделать многое для того, чтобы поднять российский Дальний Восток и Восточную Сибирь. Вот в таких конкретных, так сказать, областях сотрудничества, где можно было бы новые варианты Сколково российско-американские создавать. Я думаю, в этом лежит путь к большему взаимопониманию и строительству того доверия, в котором мы нуждаемся. И очень печально, как правильно сказал Евгений Велихов, что сегодня, к сожалению, повестка дня холодной войны, ядерное оружие, она не изжита, и нам все равно приходится договариваться в рамках повестки дня контроля над вооружениями, поскольку без ядерного оружия ни мы, ни Соединенные Штаты пока долгое время еще жить не сможем. Это печальная необходимость. И, видимо, мечты о безъядерном мире, которые еще некоторое время тому назад наши политические деятели разделяли, они сегодня уже, во всяком случае, на краткосрочную перспективу похоронены. Спасибо.
Thank you all very much. I'd like to take us to a particular issue which I think is overarching. In some ways it was part of the point at which we began the day. Dartmouth differs from many other groups in one particular, and that is that it focuses on the relationship between the two countries. And we do not use the word relationship in its casual American colloquial way. We have defined it very carefully in terms of 5 components: identity, interests, power, perceptions, and patterns of interaction. So when we talk about transforming a relationship, we have some very specific efforts in mind. Now, I want to pose to you, given that idea and all the things we've said during the day, what does each of you see as the greatest challenge in moving the U.S.-Russia relationship to a level of partnership? To use the word that we have used in our task force and we've used today, partnership is different, as one of the panelists said, from joining the West. Partnership is an equal relationship. And to get there, one has to overcome certain obstacles to genuine partnership. So my question to each of the panelists is, and I think I'll start with Big,
okay.
What is the greatest challenge to developing the kind of relationship?
I heard the question, yeah. I guess I'm being asked first because I didn't have the advantage of listening to the discussions in the course of the day. So I can take a kind of more daring plunge into an answer. I would put it this way. I think the greatest obstacle is the following, and I'll amplify. On the American side, public ignorance. On the Russian side, institutional interests. That is to say, on the American side, we do have a public, I'm sorry to say, which is embarrassingly ignorant about the world. And this is not just about Russia. It's, in general, a public that's very badly informed about political issues. And that does not help the making of foreign policy, given the fact that we are a democracy, and on big issues, foreign policy initiatives have to have broad support. In the absence of that support, it is quite easy to paralyze movement, especially when deep emotions are involved or strong interests are involved. So the ignorance of the American public, I think, is a serious problem. On the Russian side, it is some institutional legacies of the past, the security services, for example, some elements in the government that have still a residually authoritarian concept of what ought to be the relationship of the state to the public, a certain predisposition to overemphasize secrecy or to sustain genuine transparency. I think those are some of the impediments, and they might be reinforced in some cases by a linkage between institutions of power and oligarchical interests which are connected with internal power. I think these are the obstacles, but I think they're waning. I have a sense that what we're witnessing in Russia is the surfacing of social dynamics which point in the direction of undermining these residual legacies of the past.
Thank you.
Hal?
Yeah, please.
I believe that the main obstacle is asymmetry. Asymmetry in everything, in all fields, asymmetry of beliefs, asymmetry of probably a part of values, asymmetry of power. Sometimes it's very difficult to build a partnership between in the field where you feel weaker than your partner, or on the contrary, when you feel stronger or much stronger than the partner. I'm not going to say that in general Russia is weaker, because we have more or less so equally can share responsibilities in many areas, and we are main nuclear powers. Still, the issue of mutual destroyal is our capability to destroy the other is still a relevant issue, which hopefully will not work in the future, because we need some other basis for trust and partnership. But still, this asymmetry is in my view, the main obstacle. I don't believe that there's peculiarities or these forces which Big mentioned in his explanation are so powerful, because the situation is changing. We have a new generation of people which is coming everywhere, and but of course some old things are being reproduced, unfortunately. But I'm hopeful that it will pass away.
Let me just interject that this Big has to leave for another appointment in a couple of minutes. I just want to thank him for being here, and appreciate very much your contribution. Yeah, thank you very much, Big. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Who would like to continue to respond to this question of the challenge, greatest challenge? Jack?
I would say, if I have to put it in one phrase, a lack of trust. And what contributes to that are some of the very things that have been mentioned. Institutional interests, and I wouldn't put all of those on simply the Russian side. They may be more an obstacle there, but they're also an obstacle here. I think the lack of trust means that it is extraordinarily difficult to develop a true partnership. And I think it is true that when you perceive your power relationship as unbalanced, that makes it more difficult. And I emphasize perceive, because in terms of getting things done cooperatively, if it's something that you have to cooperate to get done, it doesn't make that much difference whether one side has to do 55% and the other side 45%, or vice versa. That shouldn't be the main thrust. But nevertheless, that perception does get in the way, and the idea that either you're not contributing as much as the other or you're contributing more means that unless there is a very strong push and a very solid trust in the partner, these things get tied up in very extensive, lengthy, and often fruitless negotiations, even when the leaders are pushing for a partnership.
Denny?
Ну, я, может быть, несколько циничнее скажу, но мне кажется, что, конечно, есть много причин, которые вызывают сложности между нами, но самое главное, как говорится в России, гром не грянет, мужик не перекрестится. Есть такая пословица русская. Для того, чтобы преодолеть все эти трудности, нам нужно, конечно, серьезная причина, которая бы заставила нас по-настоящему работать вместе. И тогда все станет на свое место. Мне кажется, что такая причина существует, потому что действительно сегодня и развитие энергетического кризиса, и многие другие причины объективные приводят к тому, что мы обязательно столкнемся с необходимостью работать вместе. Вот я из своего жизненного опыта вам скажу. Вот я рассказываю вам про этот большой проект. Это самый крупный сегодня научно-технический проект. Но в 1975 году произошло событие, которое дало возможность начать этот проект. Это событие заключалось в том, что в Соединенных Штатах пришла к власти новая администрация Рейгана, которая сказала, что научные исследования и прототипы – это дело частной промышленности. И закрыла огромный проект, который мог бы то же самое сделать, такой же ИТЕР, но и законы были соответствующие, и деньги были выделены. Но этот проект был закрыт. И у Соединенных Штатов не осталось никакого выбора, как идти на сотрудничество с нами, с Европой, идти на, в общем-то, необычную форму международной кооперации. Я думаю, что сегодня мы находимся тоже в такой критической точке. То есть без кооперации мы с вами не справимся.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open the floor now for the next 10 minutes to any comments you may have, and then I'm going to invite Blair Rubel, the director of the Kennan Institute, to come up and share with us his reflections on the day. But a few questions from the floor, please.
Yeah, Bill Jones, Executive Intelligence Review. I'd like to follow up on something that Professor Naumkin said with regard to the Russian Far East. This is also a matter of the Russia-U.S.-China relationship because the Far East, underneath the tundra, the entire periodical table lies, and Russia and China, growing countries, are going to be needing some of these minerals, and that creates a basis for cooperation within Eurasia, but also for the United States. And there is a project ongoing which has the support of the Russian government of continuing the modernization of the Trans-Siberian line up to the north to Chukotka and building a Bering Strait tunnel, which would unite in a land bridge the North American continent with the Eurasian continent. Some people, it hasn't got as much attention here as it has in Russia, although it should. And some people question what is so important about Alaska. We haven't, had too much attention on Alaska except for elections sometimes. But there are also the resources in Canada and in Alaska, which are important mineral resources, as well as water, which is needed very much in places like California and the American Southwest. And there was a project which is also being renewed again, the North American Water and Power Association project, which was from the 1970s, to bring the water down into the West to create fertile fields. So it's in our own advantage. Investing in this program in the Russian Far East really is a matter of self-interest in the long term, and I think more attention should be placed to it, and I think it was important what he said on that.
Thank you. Right over here.
Thank you very much. Tadats Mori from Brookings. I have a question to Dr. Naumkin. Your reference to China was very interesting to me. And recently, many Russian experts expressed concerns about the growing gap between Russia and China on basically in a demographic term as well as economic power. And Russia is in need of foreign investment and technologies in developing Eastern Siberia and the Far East. Do you think, Dr. Naumkin, that that makes Russians to seek more cooperation with the United States to shape the new order in the region of Northeast Asia? Thank you.
Please.
Я отвечу тоже по-русски. Мне кажется, что некоторые дисбалансы демографические, мягко говоря, существуют, поскольку у нас за Уралом живет 30 миллионов человек, а только в непосредственном поясе провинции Китая у наших границ 200 миллионов человек. И нам нужно выстраивать, и мы выстраиваем отношения партнерства, они очень хорошие и хорошо развиваются с Китаем, но действительно страхи определенные есть, иногда они преувеличены, есть страхи, что будет наплыв, так сказать, китайского населения в Сибирь и на Дальний Восток, этого пока не происходит. Но дисбаланс, вот то, о чем я говорю, вот эта асимметрия, она сама по себе очень опасна. Любая асимметрия опасна. Поэтому я и упомянул в своем выступлении вот эти планы сотрудничества с Соединенными Штатами, экономического сотрудничества, которые, на мой взгляд, диверсифицировали бы удачно российскую политику развития региона и позволили бы нам смягчить вот эти вот напряженности, которые есть. Потому что сегодня остановить падение численности населения в этих непростых для жизни регионах достаточно трудно. И действительно нужны огромные инвестиции, нужна политика, которая требует каких-то преференций, вмешательства государства иногда, потому что просто этот регион очень далек от федерального центра, и чисто иногда на рыночных условиях некоторые вопросы нельзя решать. Получается, что, понимаете, для того, чтобы мне слетать во Владивосток, мне надо за билет заплатить сумму в 2,5 раза большую, а иногда и в 3 раза, может быть, большую, чем для того, чтобы слетать в Лондон на самолете. Я уж не говорю о железнодорожных тарифах. И вот политика развития региона сегодня, она входит в число приоритетов российского правительства. И я думаю, что здесь сотрудничество с Соединенными Штатами может быть вполне плодотворным и полезным.
Я бы хотел добавить, что надо, конечно, внимательно смотреть на реальный интерес Китая. Потому что, насколько я понимаю, сегодня основной план в Китае – это переселение 200-300 миллионов человек из деревень в города, а вовсе не в Сибирь. Поэтому этот план осуществляется, он идет, под него строится инфраструктура и так далее. А с точки зрения взаимных интересов, конечно, я думаю, у Китая есть большой интерес сотрудничать с Россией в области энергетики. Мы это делаем, будем делать, и многих других природных ресурсов. Поэтому я думаю, что что сегодня вот эти страхи там насчет территории, они сильно преувеличены. Вообще говоря, большая территория, она сегодня может означать еще значительно более трудную жизнь, чем это не то, что было раньше. Я поэтому не очень опасаюсь вот вопросов территориальной экспансии.
Please, yeah, sure.
Я только маленькое дополнение к этому. Я полностью согласен с тем, что говорит Евгений Павлович. Но не так просто у нас в энергетическом сотрудничестве с Китаем все. Китай не всегда готов покупать энергоресурсы у нас по тем ценам, по которым вообще это принято делать. И у нас иногда ведется, как вы знаете, острая борьба с Китаем. Есть элементы торга очень серьезные, которые, в общем, препятствуют такому быстрому развитию сотрудничества. Это нормально, естественно, но в том, что преувеличены эти страхи, я абсолютно согласен. Я не думаю, что сейчас китайцы поедут массами, так сказать, осваивать Сибирь. Нет, не думаю.
Thank you. I'm going to close this off now, if I may, because I want to give Blair Rubel, the director of the Kennan Institute, ample time before our adjournment to share his reflections on the day. And I must say I appreciate his agreeing to do this, because trying to pull together the richness of today's discussion is no easy task. Thank you, Blair.
Well, thank you. When I agreed to do this, I thought it would be much easier. This has been a very rich and full day of conversations and observations, and I promised Hal I would try to do this in 15 minutes, and I will try to keep that promise. Even, I warn you, it may become a little bit telegraphic. It's not fully digested because I've just listened to it, but I think that there are a couple of points I can make. And just to be sure that you all stay awake, I'll put some edge into it. I might not be able to defend everything I'm about to say, but I think there are some ways in which I can pose questions that will stimulate you for further discussion after you leave the room. And I want to go back to Lee Hamilton's opening questions. He said there are two central questions. Is the U.S. relationship still important, and where is the relationship going? And I think what became very clear immediately, but it's continued throughout this final panel, is that the answer to the second question depends on the answer to the first question. Is the relationship still important? And there are many, many reasons to believe that for many, many Russians and many, many Americans, not those of you who are in this room today, but for many of our compatriots, the relationship just doesn't seem that important anymore. And I think that that is really the critical challenge, and I'm going to play that theme out. Now, Hal Sanders slightly reframed the question in a very useful way when he repeated Ambassador Byerly and his Russian interlocutor's question about where are the constituencies. But the constituencies only exist if there is attention to a problem and there is a shared wide belief that the relationship is important. And this led us to Phil Stewart's first observation that Dartmouth has demonstrated that Russians and Americans can work together, which is absolutely true, and you can't have been here all day and not realize that. And yet we went immediately into Igor Nagdasia's video, which I thought underscored the asymmetries, that word which was used in the wrap-up, in perceptions about the relationship and why there's a falling off of attention and interest in the relationship in both countries. And there were many things in that video which caught my attention, but there were two comments, one made by an American woman and one by a Russian gentleman, that I think really hold the key. The American woman said, if Russia does well, the world does well. And the Russian gentleman said, Americans have a very concrete plan to take over Siberia and the Far East, a very concrete plan. The challenge is, and the reason why there are such weak constituencies in both countries, is too many Americans don't believe what that woman had to say. They don't believe that Russia's fate is important for the world. And too many Russians believe in some form what the man had to say. So the challenge becomes really answering those kinds of perspectives. Brad Rourke effectively underscored the underlying asymmetries in the relationship by looking back to the 2001-2003 period, in which Russians, as he characterized it, largely wanted to be viewed as equals in the relationship, and Americans didn't feel we had to accept the notion of reciprocity. A more blunt statement of Russia's viewpoint could not be far off the mark. Russia wanted to be taken seriously, and for reasons which were discussed all through the day, we didn't really want to. And then Denis Makarov explored how there have been shifts in Russian perceptions. But from that starting point, you can only imagine how the shifts have taken place. And he made a very important point I want to return to over and over again, that Russians are much more concerned about a pragmatic domestic agenda, and they no longer believe that the United States is important to resolving that domestic agenda. He kept using the word isolationist, but of course isolationism in the United States was a little bit different and has a little bit different meaning, because what he's really talking about is Russian selective engagement with the world at large in order to solve Russian problems. And it's not clear to many, many Russians why the U.S. should be the focus of that engagement. John Doble then took us further and looked at the American side and was suggesting that Americans are increasingly concerned about the weakening of the American economy, not about security in the sense that it was talked about in the original Dartmouth context, not about nuclear security, not about the war on terrorism, but about economic security. And from that point of view, most Americans think that Russia is irrelevant. And frankly, that's not an unrealistic position. And I don't have time to go into that. But I think it really, for people who want to promote the relationship, we really need to talk seriously about how Russia is important to solving that domestic problem. But Dobel also pointed, I think, in a very important direction. He spoke quite explicitly about the transformation from a focus on physical security to economic security to a very different place. And that different place is where I think the rest of the conversation takes us, which is partnership. How Russia becomes important to the United States, and the United States becomes important to Russia because I think it was Jack Matlock said, we can't solve problems we need to solve for ourselves in a global context without the cooperation of the other. There's the answer to the question, but that answer still doesn't carry a lot of weight in the political process and public opinion of both countries. And I think that's the central nub of the day's discussion. And what Dartmouth, it seems to me, shows is that the solution to that question is a long, hard slog of small steps, of long-term engagement, of little steps for little feet, avoiding the grand architecture, as Zbigniew Brzezinski said, but of really serious engagement. And it takes an organization like Dartmouth to do that because, as we heard Jim Leach say, if there is human nature, there's government nature. And government nature is to meet deadlines, it's to meet budgets, it's to think in the short term. And a question was asked about the binational commissions. And I would argue, for all the good that the binational commissions might do, they're not a substitute for this kind of relationship because by definition they're going to be driven by political processes and have too short-term, they need much more support than they're getting, but they also need more time. And this is the problem with Reset. Reset talks about going back to some previous point when what all of the discussion suggests is we need to move to a new point. And at that point, at that moment, I was very much reminded about another session we had here in my urban capacity on community resilience. And there were wonderful community organizers from around the world. And one of the most amazing meetings I've ever chaired, Arif Hassan, a community organizer from Karachi, sat here and looked out at a room of US funders and said, we don't need money. We need time. And money isn't time. It's the time dimension that Dartmouth was committed to that is missing in the government-to-government relationship. And it's the time commitment that is so important. And then the other thing that Arif said that was very important, he came to a panel on community resilience. And this gets to the heart of the reset button. He said, I can't think of a more dangerous idea than community resilience. And of course, all the Americans in the room think that resilience is a good thing. How can you think that? How can you think that? And the South Africans agreed with him, and people from South Asia agreed with him, and people from Latin America agreed with him. When they hear resilience, they think of a return to the status quo ante. What they say is necessary is real and profound change. And I think that's an important observation when we talk about reset. When we heard Nancy Kronich talk about the cultural dimension and Jim Leach talk about the cultural dimension, what they're really talking about is not a reset, but really moving our perceptions of one another to a different place. And they made a very powerful argument that you can see that happening in culture, in the arts, in sports. There's not a Washington sports fan who doesn't know who Ovechkin is. That's a really important development, because when it comes to thinking about Washington sports, Russia is essential for a positive outcome. But when it comes to thinking about American national interest, Russia is not essential. And what Nancy was saying and what Ovechkin shows, and there are plenty of other examples of this, every symphony orchestra in the United States shows, is it's not just about reset, it's about recalibrating our understanding of what success is. And this led us into the lunch, where David Matthews talked about the need for supplemental diplomacy, not back-channel diplomacy. A very important point, which I'm not going to have time to do justice with, but that kind of supplemental diplomacy, again, only becomes important if Russia and the United States are engaging on a global agenda and not a bilateral agenda. And here, I thought Daniel Yankeliewicz's remarks were really quite sobering. we can think of a shared global agenda. We can think about the challenges of radical Islam. We can think about shared economic challenges. But what it's going to take to elevate the United States and American consciousness and alter the place of the United States in Russian consciousness is more than just talking about that agenda. It really requires a change not based on information. It was very important what he said. It's attitudes, it's values. It's a whole complex of how we come to think about the world in which information is really only a small part. So we sat around all day sharing information about how wonderful the relationship is. That's very, very important. It's certainly important for us. But there's a bigger task out there, which is to address that question when an unemployed American says, why should I care about Russia? It's having an answer to that question. When a Russian is concerned that NATO, an organization that they've heard about their entire lives in a negative context, has some evil design on his or her country, it's not just enough to say, golly gee, it really doesn't. We're all in this together. You really have to change the emotional impact of that. And this comes to another theme of the day. We talked a lot about prose, but we talked a surprising amount about poetry. Wasn't what I expected. I didn't expect to hear Walt Whitman or Dostoevsky come up today, but I'm going to return certainly to Whitman at the end. So we need more Dartmouths, but we need multiple Dartmouths. We need to do this over and over and over again. And where is the will for that to come from? That's the part of it that's unclear. Because of lack of interest, because of lack of resources, because of lack of a belief that we really matter as much to one another as we do. Now, since you all were here in the afternoon, I don't want to spend a lot of time reciting the very important observations that were made this afternoon. It's remarkable how much wisdom there was on the panel. And all the issues I've just talked about were raised by the speakers this afternoon. But let me jump ahead in 5 minutes to the last panel, because I think the last panel really was a good summation of the challenges ahead of us. And I think what becomes clear when you listened to Jack Matlock or to Evgeny Velikov, there's not a major challenge facing either country that couldn't be advanced, that couldn't have a more positive solution than if we cooperate with one another. They both gave remarkable examples of that, and they both gave remarkable examples of how that cooperation already takes place. It doesn't have to be invented. It exists. Think of all the examples Velikov gave throughout his presentation. But then we end up with the issues that Vitaly and Zbigniew Brzezinski raised. This relationship is embedded in a multipolar world. Brzezinski talked about, embedded the relationship in Russian and American relations with Europe and with the so-called near abroad. Vitaly spoke about the Islamic world, China. We need forums and mechanisms to force Russians and Americans to think about one another, not within the bilateral relationship, but within the context of global problem solving. We need to look at issues like maternal health and have Russians and American specialists in the room talking about that, about post-disaster help. Think about what's going on in Haiti right now and how much experience Russians and Americans have to bring to that kind of problem solving. But that means that both Russians and Americans need to think of themselves as global actors. I think we're a little bit more comfortable with that concept, perhaps, than Russians are at this point. And it's not an evil Russian plot to insert themselves in the world. It's that there's Russian knowledge that can actually help alleviate the problems. And I think that's the kind of restructuring in the relationship that needs to take place. And I think Brzezinski really pointed in that direction in his remarks, and I think it's very important that he pointed in that direction. Not that that was the direction that a speaker pointed in, but that Zbigniew Brzezinski, I mean, for those of us who have listened to him over the years, think of how remarkable it is. He came back from Moscow and said the leadership of Russia is really committed to modernization. That's a statement, I have to say, I personally never thought I would hear from Zbigniew Brzezinski. We need to pay attention to that, and we need to help that process, but two things need to happen. We need to take Russia seriously as a global player and not just as an object of a reset in a bilateral relationship. But Russia also needs to become very serious about its own place in the world. And I really want to return to a point that he made in passing, but I very firmly believe it's the importance of history and memory in this region. You're not going to have modernization in Russia until Russia comes to terms with its own past. And Russia, for any number of reasons, some we can all understand, but Russia's had a very difficult time dealing with that. There's a need for serious, as Brzezinski said, serious examination by professional historians of the past. But what's happened in recent years? Not only are archives closed, but Russian historians who are trying to delve into their own past find themselves arrested for trading secrets. That's the level at which Russia really has to change. It's very nice that Medvedev could convince Brzezinski that he is serious about modernization. But more important is that a Russian historian can go look at a Russian archive to prepare an article for an international journal and not be arrested for doing so. That Russian scientists can conduct their research on all the issues we heard about today and share that research with the world and not worry about espionage laws. That's a very serious issue. That issue will only be resolved when Russians become comfortable in their relationship with the outside world and comfortable in their relationship with countries like the United States, which is why the United States needs to back away from our attitude, which is Russia is unimportant to us. Russia isn't important to us. We need to come to terms with that fact. And that's it's not the same level of discomfort, but it's a very uncomfortable fact in the American political system. And unless those two things happen, we're not going to have any constituency, which is important to drive the relationship. Now, it was wonderful to hear Whitman, and I was reminded many times during today of one of my favorite lines from Whitman, which comes, I believe it comes from Leaves of Grass. No, Song of Myself. Unscrew the locks from the doors. Unscrew the doors themselves from their jambs. We've reached a point in U.S.-Russian relations where both sides really need to fundamentally air out the room and think about the relationship differently and escape the old door jambs of how we talk about one another. And that's very, very hard because I want to close with a quote from another writer, Jorge Luis Borges, who wrote something about cities, which is why I know this quote, but I think it's very important for this relationship. He said, "The picture of the city we carry around in our minds is always slightly out of date. The relationship Russians and Americans carry around in our minds with one another is always out of date, slightly. And we're not going to have the constituency we need to fundamentally change the relationship in either country until our images of one another and of ourselves are slightly more up to date." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Blair. A phenomenal job at an intellectual tour de force. And we hope to. We're delighted that we have audio taped this meeting, so we will have a transcript
I
of
couldn't
this.
reproduce it.
And I'm sure you couldn't. Let me thank all the panelists, not only these here, but those there, and my colleague Phil Stewart for all of his collaboration in figuring out how to make this day work. and especially to all of you, and to the Wilson Center, the Kennan Institute, and to everyone here. I have a couple of logistical statements, which sometimes are the most important things that one needs to do. First of all, I think our technicians would appreciate it very much if on your way out the door you could put your headphones on a table out there so they won't have to go searching from them, for them among your seats. For those of the Dartmouth group here and others Kettering related who are going back to the Washington Marriott, there is a bus there downstairs, and we will have people along the way to direct you to the right door of exit. And for those of you in the same group, particularly Kettering trustees, going back to the Hay Adams, there will be a separate bus for you, so make sure you get on the right one. Again, thank you all so much. This has been an historic day, a remarkable moment in our experience, and we're so delighted that so many of you came to share it with us. We thank you.
And Hal, I just want to thank you and all your colleagues from Kettering. This has really been a delight for all of us at the Wilson Center because we haven't had to do anything. You and your colleagues have done all the work, so I want to thank you.
Well, we thank you and all of your staff who've made us so comfortable.